There are new statewide rules that'll help you legalize an unpermitted ADU or apartment conversion in California. The state promised a very easy path to legalizing accessory dwelling units with AB 2533, but the truth is complicated and it varies city to city. I've studied the checklists and process from dozens of cities across California, and we're going to look at the best and the worst in this video to prepare you for what the actual process will be like. To understand whether a city is being friendly or unfriendly toward unpermitted ADUs, there's a couple different things you can do, and I've been struggling to figure out how to show you because there's like dozens of cities have already complied with AB 2533, and they've generated checklists that their inspectors are supposed to use for these inspections of substandard living conditions. And even though all of those checklists are supposed to be based on this one page of code, you've got implementation all across the board. Some cities like Anaheim are doing these one-pager checklists. Other cities have put out 10 plus pages, and it's super unintuitive because sometimes that one-pager is actually way scarier, more prescriptive, and more detailed than the big whoppers. And so it's kind of all across the board. And the best way to go into it, the best way to explain it to you without reading every single line of every single checklist on camera, I'm just going to drill down on a couple specific examples and show you how to interpret the range of implementation that exists with these checklists. Let's start with the actual health and safety code. You can look this up online, or there's a link in the video description below, but this is section 17920.3, just rolls off the tongue, and it explains the substandard living conditions that inspectors are allowed to flag you for if you have an unpermitted ADU. And you can see here's a list of conditions that would allow them to flag you, right? And the conditions start with little a, and then there's a big sub list. They go to little b, and you go all the way to the letter O. So there's a bunch of different conditions that we're going to go through. And here's an example of a city that has basically copy-pasted the relevant chunks from that checklist. So you can see right here, lack of or improper water closet, lavatory, bathtub, or shower in a dwelling unit. And the exact same phrase appears here. And they just switched the number and the letter, right? But otherwise, it's a very similar list. Now, in this list, the health and safety section, there are some lines that are about the number of guests in a hotel or the number of plumbing fixtures in a hotel. Your AD is not a hotel, so those lines have been omitted, even in the cities that just copy-pasted the checklist, right? But that's kind of the basis of this. Once you familiarize yourself with the health and safety code section that the cities are supposed to be using, it is much easier to see, oh yeah, this checklist is pretty much just using the health and safety code section. That's a good start. Now, having said that, some cities are going to make some formatting changes. Here's the city of Vacaville's checklist. I actually like what it does here because not only does it have the individual line items from the regulations, but then it's got columns, and the columns, this is pretty important. I like that they have 3 columns. It's not just pass or fail. It's yes, no, or TBD. You know, a lot of these checklists are going to kind of influence your inspector to either mark you as compliant or in violation. And inspectors like to cover their butts, right? So if there's a third option that says to be determined or not verified, that gives the inspector a potential box they can tick that isn't immediately sending you to zoning jail or whatever. On the other hand, there's a whole cluster of cities in Southern California that they've taken a different approach. So even though it's a copy-paste, and you can kind of see they've changed the order of things just to make it, but the section we were looking at here, it still appears in this inadequate sanitation and structural hazards. Here you go. So it's still this basic copy paste. Proper water closet, lavatory, bathtub, shower, right? See, that same line still appears. But then in some places, they've gotten oddly prescriptive. And so let's look at one of those specific examples that's going to hone in on how different jurisdictions have described one simple line. So for the next example, we're going to talk about this line, lack of minimum amounts of natural light required by this code. This is a really confusing line because required by this code isn't spelled out in this section, health and safety. And, you know, I'm foreshadowing this is going to come up. Now let's go to one of the chillest checklists in the entire state. El Dorado County, they don't have the copy-paste of lavatories and water closets. They just call them toilets. And what's more, this minimum amount of natural light, here's the checklist, page 1, page 2, page 3, no mention of natural light, because whoever made this checklist realized that the code has no requirements for the ADUs that already exist to have natural light minimums. Unfortunately, they are one of the few jurisdictions that realize that. Most of the jurisdictions have stuck some line like this in there, even though it's like the line about hotels. You could have just removed it entirely. Back to Vacaville, which I think is a good example, they still put minimum amounts of natural light and ventilation required by this code. And, they copy-pasted the line. Now, when you go and look what's required by this code, you'll find nothing is required. But that's still there. If the code changes, it gets updated with them. On the other hand, if we travel to Redondo Beach, here their checklist says a minimum of 8% of natural light is provided based on existing floor area of habitable rooms. What's that about, right? Where'd they get this really specific 8% number, and how do you even calculate that? So I'm a diligent little nerd. I try to go find how to calculate 8% of natural light, and there's no mention of this in the section of code that I understand regulates existing ADUs. The only place I can find it is in this section about like mobile home parks and certain other kinds of things under Title 25, which is not generally what we're looking at. This is further confirmed by another city on my naughty list. Lafayette also has this reference to Title 25, Section 2002. And they repeatedly reference a thing called Chapter 2.2. And this is the only place in the code that I can find this percentage light requirement. And it's completely about mobile home parks. So here's this Chapter 2.2. And sure enough, this section in Title 25 on mobile home parks and installations has an article about accessory buildings and structures. And I'm pretty sure that these city checklists all just saw accessory buildings and decided to use this requirement. I'm not a city attorney. I'm not even an attorney. This is not legal advice for your specific situation. Go talk to your cities about your specific situation. What it does do is it gives you a vibe for how some of the cities are interpreting this code. And hey, it would be a shame if a housing authority watched the video and decided to offer some technical assistance to some of these cities, right? Hope that doesn't happen. So for the next example, we're going to talk about this line, visible mold growth as determined by a health officer or a code enforcement officer, as defined in section 829.5 of the Penal Code, excluding the presence of mold that is minor and found on surfaces that can accumulate moisture as part of their properly functioning and intended use. That's a big jargony line, right? In some cities, like the city of Vacaville, they've just reduced that to visible mold growth as determined, right? So they've simplified the line. They've kept, hey, if you got visible mold growth, that's not a great sign for your inspector, and they should flag that, right? Now, if we take the city of Redondo Beach, they've put visible mold growth is not present, excluding the presence of mold that is minor and not found on surfaces that can accumulate moisture as part of the properly functioning and intended use. They've kept more of the language, but they've stripped out like the definition of an inspector. Still useful, still on target, right? Now let's go to the city of Anaheim. This is one of the one-pagers I was talking about. And here you see it all fits on one page, so you think it might be an easier checklist. But their version of this is verify the vapor barrier is in place under the slab to prevent moisture wicking, potentially creating a health hazard with mold. Now, that's a complete deviation from the visible mold with certain exceptions. Now we're worried about the hazard of potential mold, right? And that's a great example of how wide a berth some of these cities are taking in their interpretation of these individual lines. Like, how am I even supposed to check for a vapor barrier under the slab without destroying a part of my foundation? Nobody knows. Anyway, from those specific examples, you kind of get the gist. Every single line in the Health and Safety Code can be interpreted in a huge variety of ways. And what we want to do is have you equipped to know whether the checklist in your city is really based on the section of health and safety code it's supposed to be based on, or whether it's overreaching a little. Okay, one more thing that's worth flagging is this section that sits outside the list of conditions. So we're going to flip all the way to the last page of the health and safety code section. It ends in O, inadequate structural resistance to horizontal forces. But then there's these two other paragraphs. And these two other paragraphs say, hey, there's a bunch of exceptions that apply to all the conditions A through O. If a condition, sorry, I'll just read it exactly so I'm not paraphrasing here. A condition that would require displacement of sound walls or ceilings to meet height, length, or width requirements for ceilings, rooms, and dwelling units shall not by itself be considered sufficient existence of dangerous conditions, making a building substandard. Making a building a substandard building. Sorry, shouldn't paraphrase. So that section, importantly, applies to the whole list of conditions. Some cities, like Vacaville, realize that, and they remind their inspector in the last part of their checklist by putting that whole message there. Ideally, the way Vacaville did it, it seems like just one more item on the checklist, which it's arguable whether you want that to be at the introduction at the top or in a conclusion at the bottom. But by putting it in the literal checklist, you kind of guarantee that every inspector is going to read it. So that's how they chose to put it in there. And that's a very powerful message. Compare that to a city that's kind of in a misbehaving like Anaheim. And their last action is, while every attempt has been made to provide a comprehensive list, the infield inspection may determine other issues that could prevent approval or the delay of an enforcement, right? So you got two very different examples of how to handle this. One is like, and remember, even though this checklist is printed, if a thing would make your building even less safe by moving a load-bearing wall or something, we're not crazy. The other city's like, and despite the fact that we've published this list, we could find more things in the field. And that's that difference in vibes again. All right. So that kind of gives you an understanding of how to read the checklist and whether the checklist in your city is aggressive or relatively friendly. But that's just the checklist. The checklist is just one part of the application process. The other part is going to be what you actually need to submit along with that inspection. For example, some cities, like Vacaville, are requiring full construction documents, plot plans. It's not on this form, but they're also going to require proof that your ADU is built before January 2020. It can get really complicated. So watch this playlist of videos next, and I'm going to dive into all the details about how people are saving a lot of time and money when they're thinking about getting permits for their unpermitted ADU.